So, what else about Marden's railway? I mentioned earlier that it was a very, very busy station comparative to the size of the village. There were apparently, literally, thousands of bushel of apples taken away, transported from Marden Station during the hard fruit season to London markets and beyond, to Birmingham, Sheffield, Manchester. This piece of line through from Ashford and up to Red Hill is the longest straight stretch of line in the country. That's not to say it's not up and down hill. It does undulate, which therefore used to hamper speeds a little bit in the steam days, but it was still possible to get up a decent speed of 80 or 90 miles an hour on the downhill stretches, simply sort of going down through here down towards Staplehurst, as I say, uphill obviously the other way. And it used to be used for test running quite often when a new steam engine was being designed or built or whatever. There are some blacker sides to Marden's railway history, and one of the saddest, one of the most tragic, was a crash that occurred on the 4th of January 1969, just about a mile or so ahead of me here behind the camera, down near Long End's Arch. It was a very, very foggy night, an icy fog at that, and there had been signalling problems with a signal down there at the time. The front train, a parcels train, newspaper train, had stopped on a red signal. The driver had got down to phone ahead to the signalman to ask for clearance to proceed, but as I say, there had been signalling problems, and what really happened will never be known, but the train behind either failed to see a red signal, or saw a signal that should have been red, and due to this problem was not that colour, was green, and ran into the back of the parcels train. Sadly, 4 people were killed, including the driver of the second train, and say 3 passengers. Very tragic. You could stand here, I stood here as a lad of just 19, 20, on the Sunday morning. The crash was on a Saturday evening, and you could see the coaches of the crash train reared right up in the air from here. I was actually in the Checkers, the pub just round the corner, when the crash happened, as many of us village lads used to be on a Saturday night, and being the Saturday after New Year and recently after Christmas, we had no money to dive off into Maidstone to go gadding about, so we were having a quiet pint in the Checkers. When his fireman came in through the door, Maidstone fireman, obviously didn't know the area, asking the way to the lane, and saying there had been a crash. We were quite tempted to go and help. We didn't go and help, not for any fear or worry of unpleasantness, gore, dead people or whatever, but because obviously they were the experts and we thought best left to them. But there were some local residents from the farms down at Long Ends that did heroic work that night, ferrying the uninjured passengers across the fields, because it's a very remote area, from the crash site to farms and their houses and that sort of thing, and just making coffee and tea and keeping them comfortable and warm, etc. And certainly several of the farm workers did receive commendations afterwards for their help and assistance with that accident. The Board of Inquiry, I think, eventually came down to driver error of the driver of the second train. They decided that the work that had been done in the signal to default the problem had been sufficiently remedied, but as I say, sadly, we will never know the outcome of that. You may also know, and it's a bit further in that direction, back in the 1860s, of what was known as the Staplehurst smash, and that was a train crash that happened, I think it was 1868, between Staplehurst and Headcorn, where there is a bridge over the River Belt, and they were doing track works, track repair, track maintenance. Now in those days, boats from the continent ran to tide and weather, and not much else. They didn't have the sophisticated systems they have nowadays that allow boats to run to timetable and sort of docks and berths and that sort of thing. So the gang leader, the plate layer leader, didn't have details of a boat train that had run up to connect to an incoming boat up to London on his timetable. And therefore, when the train approached, they had several sections of track lifted. The train, the engine itself, leapt the gap, but several of the coaches didn't. Some tumbled into the river belt, and others were derailed. There were, again, some fatalities, I believe 8 or 9 fatalities, but one of the passengers on that train was Charles Dickens, who was returning from Paris with his mistress, and he, again, was very, very shaken, very naturally, very, very shaken by the accident, but also, like these farm workers in Marden 102 years later, assisted the injured and comforted the dying in that smash. And the general consensus is, the opinion is, that he was never the same person again. It did affect him very, very severely. It affected his health as well as his state of mind. And rumour has it that his writing never actually had the same sort of impact that it did prior to that smash. So the Stapler smash of I think it was 1868. I mentioned earlier the sidings, the good sidings in Marden, and standing where I am now, I'm actually standing on where the track bed used to be for one of the sidings. It's quite amazing how things can disappear totally without trace in a very short space of time. This fence is the original railway fence, but behind, and you can just see a second fence in there, barbed wire. Between these two fences used to be the track, the path that the cattle walked along to go to the cattle pens, which were roughly where those planks are. You can just see them in the distance. So all this you see here was sidings. There was one siding went down here. I say I'm standing on the track bed virtually. There were 2 more main sidings running along there where the coal generally was unloaded, coal weighing machines, open doors, all sorts of things to fall over and trip over. But in those days there was no such thing as health and safety or whatever, and as lads we used to sort of wander around and do what we want to. You've seen the loading ramp behind me where heavy machinery was rolled on and rolled off, tractors and carts and that sort of thing. The lower car park was completely given over to huge piles of coal, logs, sacks of corn and coke and corn and other animal feeds, because that was owned or hired, at least in the railway company, by Miskin and Sons, who were local corn and coal merchants. At the end of the station building, and of course that's not the original one, that was built about 1984, there was a goods shed with a crane in it, and again another siding where more perishable goods could be loaded and offloaded under cover, more waterproof or whatever. And all this was a hive activity. There was no car parking space in those days because nobody had cars. There was a little space in front for someone to come along and drop off a passenger, but there was nothing like the number of cars that are here now, and of course this is really totally a commuter station. So yeah, very, very busy area, and the sidings themselves closed in April 1962, just about 10 months after electrification, when British Rail nationally stopped bothering with little wagon loads of freight and that sort of thing, just no longer interested, and road haulage took over.